I will offer brief introductions to these two guests. Then we'll hear from Margot for about 15 minutes of a presentation, and then the panel will open into a more informal discussion, and there'll be an opportunity again for asking questions, both to the producer of the film as well as to Professor Crawford, about the film and about its relationship to Toni Morrison's work writ large. As we've heard, Ford Morrison is executive producer and creator of The Foreigner's Home. He was born in Washington, D.C., and studied at the University of California at Berkeley and at the Architectural Association in London. He's now based in New York City and is an architect for Princeton University's Plasma Physics Laboratory. Professor Margot Natalie Crawford is Edmund J. and Louis W. Kahn Professor for Faculty Excellence and Chair of the English Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a scholar of 20th and 21st century African American literature and visual culture and global Black studies. Crossing boundaries between literature, visual art, and cultural movements, her scholarship opens up new ways of understanding Black radical imaginations. Her books include What is African American Literature, Black Post-Blackness, the Black Arts Movement and 21st Century Black Aesthetics, New Thoughts on the Black Arts Movement, and in 2018, she co-edited a special issue of UNCA Journal of Contemporary African Art with our own Salah Hassan, titled Global Black Consciousness. Welcome, Professor Crawford.
Thank you, Ford Morrison, for producing this tremendous film. This film revealed new dimensions of the art of Toni Morrison. Our study of this tremendous artist is only beginning. Consider the limits of documentary when it does not become art. I think it becomes comparable to what you're looking at now. This particular production of Toni Morrison's work is such a packaging of Toni Morrison. It's such a packaging of Toni Morrison, what you see displayed. It's a container, I think we would agree. And even when it opens up, right? And I'm sure this publishing press, Juniper, right, would not be happy with my words, but what I'm getting at is it visualizes this sense that there's such cohesiveness and you can know everything about Toni Morrison. And as opposed to letting Toni Morrison be a foreigner that is home, that's what I think we learn from this documentary as it includes that art. We allow ourselves to know what Edward Gleason says in such a resonant way, that people have a right to be opaque. I think we feel that opacity when we think about these next images. I'll show you this one here, one of the pages after the fire, the pages of U.A.E, where you have to wonder, as Toni Morrison says in the beginning of A Mercy, can you read? Once again, this is not that packaging, that sense that you can know everything about Toni Morrison, but rather something else being visualized in these images. I also think so much about Toni Morrison's own attempt in this image to think about the narrator and character relations in the novel Love, another image, right, that makes us wonder, what is being rendered here? Nothing quick and easy that can be processed in this image. One more. This map, some of you will have seen, is a way that as Morrison is sketching, beginning to think about the structure of the novel Paradise, the way that she presents this type of mapping that ultimately in that novel, as opposed to this town Ruby, when we think about the convent in relation to this town Ruby, we think about what Morrison will not map for us. In her 1975 lecture at Portland State University, Toni Morrison asserts, "When Black writers write, they should write for me. There is very little literature that's really like that, Black literature. I don't mean that it wasn't necessary to have the other kind. Richard Wright is not talking to me, or even you. He's talking to some white people. He's explaining something to them. And I know when they're talking just past my ear, when they're explaining something, justifying something, just defining something." The transcription of this interview then reads, "glass thunks." Later in this same interview, Morrison refers to writing, quote, "for all those people in the book who don't even pick up the book, all those non-readers, all those people in Sula who A, don't exist, and B, if they did, wouldn't buy it anyway. But they are the ones to whom one speaks, not to the New York Times, not to the editors, not to any distant media, not to anything. It is a very private thing. They are the ones who say, yeah, that's right." This peculiar, puzzling sense of writing to an ideal reader who does not exist takes us to the power of Toni Morrison's art. Toni Morrison created space for what was not yet here. Carol Walker's visual images of Morrison captured this sense of an artist inspired by, quote, "a very private," and I'm going to add, "Black thing." Walker was commissioned by the New Yorker to create a cover image of Morrison after Morrison passed. Walker explains in the 2019 cover story interview, quote, "I wasn't sure what to do, really. Like many artists, I looked up to Mrs. Morrison for some kind of approval and validation that I usually didn't seek in life. Through her work and words, she became something like a muse, teacher, mother, clairvoyant, and judge, always a presence urging me on. After a number of false starts, pastel, clay, I even considered watercolor, I decided to keep it familiar, to use the cutout. It's the work I do. I'm no portraitist, but I am a shadow maker," end quote. When we allow Toni Morrison to be more than an icon, we see that she was a shadow maker, a deeply experimental artist, not a portraitist. And I want to show you the full flow of Carol Walker's images that led to the New York cover. These are the preliminary images. The first poem, Carol Walker and Toni Morrison collaborated as they created 5 poems in 2002. Morrison wrote the poems and Walker added her images. In 5 poems, Morrison imagines 5 scenes of the open body, the Black embodiment of the not yet here. The open body is a phrase many of you will remember from Paradise. Consolata refers to the open bodies as she teaches the women in the convent to indulge in that art therapy as they paint their silhouettes, their open bodies on the cellar floor. The first poem, Eve Remembering, is the scene of, quote, the undoing of the eyes and the move to Black abandon. As Morrison builds on her images of bodacious Black Eves in Paradise, published in 1997, she makes the Black Eve in this poem gain a new way of seeing once she tastes, quote, sweet power. The speaker proclaims, "The taste undid my eyes." When our eyes are undone, we can feel the freedom of the Black abandon that Carol Walker captures in her non-illustration of this poem, what you see displayed here. For Walker in this image, the visual non-answer is time for withdrawal and release and refusal that becomes the space-clearing gesture of the outstretched hand and the taut arm of a Black woman twerking and letting go of the eating or wearing of the banana given to Black Eves who never had access to the forbidden apple given to white Eves. The second poem in this volume, 5 poems with once again, Morrison's words and Carol Walker's images, is entitled The Perfect Ease of Grain, and it makes Black abandon feel ecstatic as, quote, red cherries become jam. Morrison writes, ecstasy becomes us all. This part of the poetic sequence shapes Black abandon into the Ellisonian different experience of time. The, quote, time enough to spill is for Morrison the space of Black love where trauma does not define Black life. Time that does not spill, time that is contained, cannot explain the excessiveness of Black abandon, the lived experiences of being possessed by dispossession, what I think is rendered in both the poems and the images. In the third poem, Someone Leans Near, Black abandon is shaped into the breath that is, quote, on your skin. Morrison writes, then on your skin a breath caresses, the salt your eyes have shed. These lines decenter the racial epidermalization of Blackness, as Fanon calls it, as Morrison makes us imagine the imprint on the skin that the lightness of breath can create. The preposition on your skin, signals Morrison's desire to make touch skin an alternative to the racial marking of skin. The fourth poem in this sequence is a move from touch skin to the unadorned, the time of flesh that, quote, comes naked into the world. Morrison in each poem moves closer and closer to the impossible unmarking of the Black body. The final poem makes it clear that the middle passage has made the open body constantly fight to not be an enslaved captive body. Morrison writes, look how the fish mistake my hair for home. Morrison's turn to experimental poetry in this collaboration with Carol Walker is not new. Her novels include many moments of deeply experimental poetry. In Beloved, Morrison relies on experimental poetry to express the deepest registers of what she has famously described as unspeakable things unspoken. In Morrison's last novel, God Help the Child, experimental poetry in the letters written by the character Booker is the only part of the novel that invites close reading, and I should say last published novel. Morrison's last published novel is a play with surface. Carol Walker wrote the first review of this novel. Carol Walker writes, the narrative hovers, averts its eyes and sucks its teeth at the misfortunes of the characters. And like Bride, I was left hungering for warmth. I wanted to be lured even deeper into that awful golden landscape. I wanted to tug at the sleeve of the storyteller and say, yes, yes, I know all that. I get the message, but the story is the thing. Tell me the part about the trees again, and don't forget the sunlight, end quote. Walker's inability to appreciate the mystery of this last published novel makes me wonder if this last published novel is too much of a shadow maker, even for kindred spirit artists like Walker, who desire to be a shadow maker and not a portraitist. Once again, moving back to Walker's images. Morrison's last novel is about beauty and surface. In a 2015 conversation between Farah Jasmine Griffin and Morrison, Griffin confesses, I have to be self-indulgent. I know that skin color and beauty is superficial, but I, for one, was so grateful for a jet black character that is gorgeous and stunning. Why do you do that? Give it to me and snatch it back. Morrison's response should make us more interested in how Morrison, in her signature 21st century novel, God Help the Child is the only novel set in the 21st century, is producing Black blush. Morrison tells Farah Jasmine Griffin, the connection between the devastation of the first book I wrote, The Bluest Eye, and God Help the Child, the mother is unhappy about her daughter, but she turns into the whole Black, Sudanese Black, as her mother calls them, and they have these exquisite faces, I mean unbelievable. Anyway, where was I? The point is that neither one will help you. I'd rather not be ugly just to get through the street, but it's more important to be a three-dimensional person. Even if it was the glorious, glorious beauty of a glorious Black woman, it ain't enough, end quote. The unexpected Black blush that may happen when we hear Morrison, our, quote, elder, lose her train of thought as she remembers the Sudanese beauty may be similar to the way that we blush as we realize that God Help the Child may be Morrison's intentionally, quote, off novel, the novel that may call for a reading that allows surface to remain surface. This last published novel and her first book set in the 21st century shows that Morrison in her later years was boldly claiming her right to be opaque. The opaque Morrison cannot be contained, as opposed to the sense of a cohesive flow of her art. When we grant Morrison the right to be opaque, we discover that she, like her character Florence in A Mercy, keeps asking us, but can you read? Reading Morrison's last novel, God Help the Child, we have to do what Florence in A Mercy demands that the blacksmith do if he wants to learn how to read the words she is carving on the wall. We have to bend down and shape our body around the words. In A Mercy, Florence tells the blacksmith, you will have to bend down to read my telling, crawl perhaps in a few places. These words beg to be compared to Carol Walker's confession about not knowing how to, quote, bend down and begin to know how to create an image in memory of Toni Morrison. Walker writes, as she talks about that process of creating the New Yorker cover image, after a number of false starts, pastel clay, I even considered watercolor. I decided to keep it familiar to use the cutout. I think Walker was so overwhelmed after Morrison's passing and beautifully humbled by Morrison's influence that she returned to the silhouette cutout after experimenting with pastel and clay. Walker's sculptural form is one of the ones she calls the false starts, this one you see here. But this sculpture captures the words at the end of the novel Jazz. Look where your hands are now. Toni Morrison's Black art holds us, and we keep holding it and trying to figure out how to even start as we begin to understand how she never stopped experimenting with Black forms and Black formlessness. Thank you.
How's that? Okay, that's better. I'm sure both of you surely have questions for one another. But I thought I would open things up by coming back to the title of the film, which I think we can bring back to this question of Black forms in an interesting way, sort of the way the title of the exhibition, the title of the film, encompasses so much, this foreigner's home. These questions of community and belonging and exclusion that always seem to appear in her novels. Her novels, as readers in the room will remember, are filled with so many strangers in their own communities. Piccola, Setha, Sula, to name a few. But it seems to me that the title also points to a kind of internationalist side to Toni Morrison's thinking and her vision. She's describing systems of exclusion and estrangement that go beyond the specific experience of the African American context. And I found myself thinking about this parallel that the film makes, the juxtaposition of the image, the painting, which was central to the exhibit, the raft of the Medusa, which she talks about, we hear in her own words, which it seems to me depicts those who were considered sacrificable when this French naval vessel wrecked. It was en route to West Africa, en route to Senegal is what is depicted in the image, and in a way describes that brutal calculus of differentiated human worth that underpinned the European colonial project. And we have this in the film juxtaposed with these images of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, Ward 9, the very poor Black neighborhood that was also sacrificed in that moment, that was inundated with the floodwaters, and that remains largely abandoned in many ways by the government today. So I'm interested in this relationship between these two, between an international kind of understanding these wider systems and the very specific context that we recognize in her novels. So if I could just open with that, it's a lot, but.
I would like to point out that the ship you see in the painting, there was a trial in England for those people who cut the ship loose. And it happened at a time before the 1882 or Berlin Conference, where Africa was divided up. So during this time, this is when the former colonial powers were fighting against each other without an understanding between each other. So this is before 1882, before Africa was divided, and that's what this is what came about. And on the international front, she's published, I think, in 300 languages, 12 or 13 novels. You mentioned the last novel. The last novel I know about is the one she was working on when she passed away, which is called Justice. And she scrapped it twice, I think, and rewrote the book 2 times, and on the 3rd try, she was still working on the ending when she passed away. So if you'd like, I can tell you a short synopsis of the story. It takes place during the Korean War, or I guess it was called a police action then. And in the 1950s in America, in my country, there was still segregation and Jim Crow. So the main protagonist, the main character, has to travel from Seattle to Philadelphia, just across the country like that. But because of the race and the racial problems at the time, he has to travel by night. Now, some of you may have heard of the Green Book, because that was a way for motorists to get across the country. But because he was alone and not very well off, he traveled by night. In order to travel by night, he has a telescope, and he follows the stars to get from point A to point B. And to not give anything away, he gets to the East Coast, and he's up on a hill at night, and he takes out his telescope to see where he is and to look at the stars. And down in the area below are some police, and they look and they see the flash of light off of the telescope, and they can't determine if it's someone's watch, or if it's a telescope, or if it's the scope of a rifle. So the ending hasn't been finished yet, but that's where it lands. Does he go make his way safely, or does he, get killed by the police? So that's all I wanted to point out about that.
Thank you. I love hearing about what will soon be the last novel. So Justice is on my mind. I'm so happy to hear some of those details. And I think that when we think about everything that you do in this film, I think in such an exquisite manner in terms of bringing what I would say the local, the national and the international, so to speak, together. I think for about the very breaks, so to speak, in the film when we have the chalk-like figures, the figures in black and white, because for me, and I'm not sure about other viewers, but those spaces of suspension, this time watching it again, I was thinking about even that blank screen that happens right before we have, that footage on Nina Simone. I think in those chalk-like black and white boat images, we might see the international and the, quote, local for, in terms of thinking about the African-American specificity of some parts of the film and then the international. In those sequences, I see those two frames coming together. I don't see necessarily middle passage. I don't see, when we think about why then later, much later in the film, it's important that we don't have the chalk-like silhouette figures, but the actual images of particular individuals, right, who are being displaced and being rescued and being cared for and in clearly such an urgent and desperate state, and why it becomes important to see those figures at that point, but also to have these earlier moments when they are the more amorphous figures who could be so many things.
Yes, I think that's right. One of the things I noticed just now is the painting is in the late afternoon, daytime. When you see the imagery of the people in the boats, a lot of that happens at night, which makes it even more terrifying for me. So if you could imagine having to make a journey either across the country under Jim Crow or across the water, it's awfully terrifying at night. And that's why I think having to travel at night under Jim Crow is also terrifying, can also be a horror story. So I'm working on I signed a contract for a new book that's due in May. It's a collection of essays that were taught at Princeton on Africa and the image of blacks in Western art. That's a tentative title. But it looks at all the classic writers, Edgar Allan Poe, Faulkner, Saul Bellow, I think Willa Cather, The Artificial Nigger. Or Moby Dick is one by Herman Melville, and she has a very interesting reading, and she's a good critic of literature, but her reading of, say, Moby Dick, where you have this white whale, and the captain's trying to kill the whale, what he's really killing is white supremacy, okay? And that's what the book is about. The same thing is true in another story he wrote called Benito Sereno, where upon boarding a slave ship, a white man sees a slave shaving the captain, giving him a shave. Upon finding out that the boat is in mutiny, he realizes he was holding the razor to the captain's neck. So in an instant, you can see the duality of docile, passive slave and the evil, wild savage. And it's all about the perception given by Melville.
That's on. Circling back to what you were sharing about justice, I know that it's not just me. I think many people in the audience would love to hear more about Sula. You told us earlier that there may be a film or some type of cinematic adaptation of Sula, Song of Solomon, and also a stage production of Beloved. So I just wanted to seize this moment to see if you'll share anything about any of those possibilities.
I can't say much, except that it takes a very long time, as I found out making this film. I would never attempt to put my mother's work on film. She's very difficult to put on the screen. So that's why I tried to do just a film about her at this particular event. But no, it's true. HBO, they want to do 7 hours. I think they started with 10 hours. So I've received 2 or 3 scripts from the writer. And I think HBO, it was during the strike, so I don't know what's happening now, but I think they might pick it up again. It's about Sula, and what they have to do, I figured because they would have 7 hours for the film, they would have enough time to, do a good job. What ends up happening is they want to have each hour end at the sort of the peak of a crescendo to get you to watch the next episode. So I think that in a way distorts the story. So that's kind of where I'm at now with that. When it came to Song of Solomon, that is a very musical book. And I think George Wolfe is interested now, and he has a draft, and I'm hoping to get things worked out pretty soon. As far as the stage production of Beloved, there was another offer from the British to do that, and I just couldn't accept, because I think it should start in my home country, not overseas, if it's going to start at all. But the stage production would be fascinating. I'm just curious to know, there's a young writer, she's won some awards, and she's going to do the adaptation. And I think another person, she's one another, Sandy Freeman, I think she is also going to work on the project as well. So right now, I think the best script is the first episode of Sula. That's the best one. They are trying to decode certain types of language, and they made a few other mistakes in terms of a neighborhood versus, an area, just minor glitches like that. So once those are worked out, I think it can be well on its way. They haven't started principal photography on any of this yet, so. And I'm still, we're still recovering from the strike in America, and I think we're gonna wait until middle, late spring before we start on most of these projects.
I wonder, while we're talking about your projects, if I could ask you about the pedagogical aspect of this film. I know you mentioned that you were in collaboration with professors at Oberlin College in the making of this film, and that there were students involved, or there was a vision for student involvement.
Yes, that's right. I wanted the students to be involved in the project for credit at Oberlin College. It was their fledgling, I think, film program there, so this was a good way to start. I wanted it to be a film taught in the schools, and I think even politicians like our Congress were going to look at it and have a look, because it is informative and instructive, and it tries not to be too preachy, too aggressive when it comes to these sensitive topics. Was there another point you had, a question you had? Did you have it?
I'm a graduate of Oberlin College myself, so I was curious about that connection.
Well, it's still there, and it took, I'll go back to a point you made earlier, which is my original idea for the film was not very good. This is my first film, and I'm an architect by profession, so I don't really have that much experience in it, but they did develop it, and I wanted to keep my mother out of the film entirely, and they had trouble getting money because no one wanted to fund a film like that. But my idea in the beginning was to have a more hardline documentary, which wouldn't have been as interesting as this film, I don't think.
So one of the most resonant moments in the film, and I know I'm speaking for so many other people, it's when Morrison says, "Art is otherwise," and then she continues to say, "Truth is otherwise," and then she says, "It risks all." For me, I was thinking so much about how she uses that very language, risking all in a mercy, as she's describing daughter Jane, as Florence is talking to Booker and telling him that unlike what he does to her, those words that cut, right, when he tells her, "You have become slave," and so forth, all of that, leading Florence to then reclaim wilderness, to say, "You say I'm wilderness, I am." And of course, you'll remember for it in that full sequence, that's when Morrison imagines this character, Florence, trying to teach this man, Blacksmith, that unlike you, daughter Jane risks all in order to save me from that moment when she first discovers that her slave condition is indeed tied to blackness. This whole sense that Morrison is suspending us in this 1600s period, when at that point, slavery doesn't necessarily equal black body. But at that moment, when they undress her in the closet, she then knows that, yes, I am being treated as not just a slave, but as the black enslaved person. So I say all that just because that's what I hear, partially because Morrison uses that language, echoes that language, risking all. But I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of what resonates for you when Morrison writes, "Art is otherwise, truth is otherwise."
Oh, I can answer that. Yeah, when I think we went to the Biennale and we saw a Cambodian production of Othello, and that gave her this great idea of doing a play about Desdemona. As long as you take Iago out, you can have an entirely fantastic play. So she wrote this play, Desdemona, where it's really, like you say, she's risking it all in this play. And so now we're hoping to teach Othello and Desdemona together. And it should be, I think it's been a few places now in DC and in Boston, a few other places. But it's that's the combination of the two, Othello and Desdemona together, that gives students a better understanding of the context at the time. Plus, in the Desdemona, I forget the character's name, the servant, in Desdemona, yeah, she's often in the background. But in the play Desdemona, she takes, I wouldn't say center stage, but she's much more important than she is in the past, in the other writing.
The other resonance for me with the notion of risking all, I was struck by what an amazing choice it was to have the Haitian-American writer Edwidge Danticat as the interlocutor and the narrator in this film. I was thinking of her own book of essays, Create Dangerously, and this sort of recurring theme in those essays of writing and reading dangerously, of what is risked, what is courageous in those acts, particularly in situations of extreme
But you should know that
repression.
I think there's several people in the film who worked at the Princeton Atelier, where they sort of honed their skills. Edgewood was one, Yo-Yo Ma was another, Gabriel, what was it, Marquez, who wrote, Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So that's where I guess the original germ or the seed for how she understood their work kind of started. And that was a fantastic program, too. I'm trying to replicate that program now with my mother's had a foundation out of her own pocket for the last 25 years, so I'm trying to continue that as well. And it'll be based on the model she set forth with the Princeton Atelier, where she would invite artists and teachers, composers, everyone to come and teach students at such a high level that it's something they wouldn't get in any other place. So that was how that came about.
It seems also to relate to this idea of the unpoliced language, which she brings up in relation to these young slam poets that she's bringing into the sort of hallowed space of the museum, where they wouldn't have otherwise been invited, where they would have literally been policed, right? And that sort of border crossing that is performed by that decision to
But it
bring
wasn't
them.
just that. We had 5,000 or 6,000 people in the Louvre on that one day. And those people had come from Bobigny and all the surrounding Parisian areas, and they had never been in the Louvre before. And it was their first time seeing it, first time seeing the Mona Lisa. I think the French publisher was there, and she wanted to bring a bodyguard to protect herself from all the people coming in, and we just couldn't allow that. But it should be pointed out, I think they gave us a tour of the Louvre, because I got permission to go all over, and they have a pyramid in the basement, an entire pyramid from Egypt, just sitting there. Does anyone know about this? And not counting the other loot that they probably have in there too, but I was amazed at the size. It's as big as an airfield underneath the Louvre. So there's a lot more to do in research in the Louvre than what we might know.
And speaking about the Louvre, when you think about how it's so important that we're in the museum and we have images of Morrison at the podium, and we also have images of your mother in her home. Can you tell us more about why that interior space was important? Even that very scene when Edwidge Danticat walks in with the flowers. Why did you make those choices to also include that interior home space?
We needed a place that she felt comfortable. I live in that home now, as a matter of fact, and I had to renovate it a bit. But that was the one place she felt comfortable. And I'm not sure, what was the rest of your question, Ann? You said?
Really wondering why that home space was necessary. When you were talking about the museum space, it made me think about how it's so compelling to even remember that initially when you were creating this footage, you knew, as you explained earlier to me, you knew it would become a film, but you didn't quite know how you would put all of it together. So I'm wondering why you and Morrison why you and your mother wanted to include the home space.
It is rather personal, and it's as if you get, after you shoot the footage, imagine having a bag of piano keys, and you scatter them on the floor, and they tell you to make music. It's similar, because you have all this footage, and you really don't know how to organize it without a proper outline and that kind of thing. And we thought using her home would make a good base of, a visual base so people could understand where she's coming from, and an operational base too, because by then, I think it was 7 or 8 years after when we shot that footage.
This is something that came up a bit in some of the earlier questions, but we hear Toni Morrison's voice specifically addressing what she calls a pattern of genocide in this film. The pattern of nations seeking to legitimize themselves through the destruction of another. And for me, hearing those words in this moment specifically is so powerful. She talks about our responsibility to address the doom faced by millions of people, reduced to animal, insect, or polluted status by nations with unmitigated, unrepentant power to decide who is a stranger and whether they live or die. And it's, to me, impossible not to think of the Palestinians who, in this moment, face the unmitigated, unrepentant power that she speaks of. So I was thinking also of the moment earlier in the film when she's writing about the history of slavery in the United States and the necessity not to blink. So I just thought, if there's more that either of you would want to say about what it means, what she offers to us in this specific historical moment, what reading her right now offers.
So I love the question. When Morrison begins that very sequence by referring to genocide scholars, she should make all of us pause, because right now, as genocide is happening in Palestine, there are so many scholars who refuse to speak up and to even call it genocide. And I want to bet that as time passes, some of these scholars are going to become genocide scholars who then want to write about Said, for example, and want to theorize and say that somehow they even have a right to claim this field to study empire, for example, and to talk about all these matters, but you're silent right now. So I think what is at stake is that Toni Morrison, back to that question in A Mercy, can you read? Can you read me in a certain way to understand that I don't want you to make my art into some type of cultural capital, you quote genocide scholars, so that you are actually misreading me and you are refusing, as Salah Hassan said earlier, to recognize that I, Toni Morrison, I am that consummate artist and theorist, and I insist that you connect theory and praxis. So that's my answer.
I have nothing to add to that. That was point on.
On that note, perhaps we could open things up to the audience in the room. Are there other questions? I can only somewhat see through the lights, so if whoever has the microphone could help me identifying.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. I wanted to ask a question about her work, actually. I'm here in case you can't see me. A lot of times in Toni Morrison's work, there's an essence of horror and madness. And I always wondered why. For example, with The Bluest Eye, at the end when Piccola finally gets the blue eyes, and she starts to ask. Or when in Beloved, where the spirit comes. I just wanted to, because sometimes when people write about Black life, they want to make it beautiful and pretty, but she touches on a kind of horror aspect or an extreme madness of pain that comes from pain. And I know that she said from Beloved was based on a woman who thought the ducks in the pond were her babies. And that's a form of madness because her babies were lost to slavery. So I was just kind of wondering, why was that an integral part of most of her novels? Thank you.
Just, as I said, I don't read her critically except to say that she will have a complicated understory with a nice story on top. If you think it's horror, yeah, slavery is horror, and so are a lot of other things. But to make it palatable, you have to have really, really polished writing, really good sentences to make it understood in a way that won't frighten the reader, I think. She taught a class with Jacques Derrida at the École Normale Supérieure. And one of the things that happened there, I mean, even the French often say it's necessary to take risks, especially in art. And by doing so, you're not pushing the envelope, you're just explaining things the way they are. And it's up to the reader in his or her mind that ends up pushing that envelope. Does that answer your question at all?
You know, I would add, I think that absolutely you are right. So it's that steady thread of madness and horror. And also, I think I want to channel Kevin Kwashi right now, Black aliveness, his theory of Black aliveness, meaning that Morrison refuses to only make it about Black madness or Black horror. So echoing what Ford just said, I also think Toni Morrison gives us tremendously complex images of Black love. You know, another way of understanding Kevin Kwashi's way of theorizing Black aliveness, that love is not something that we need to romanticize, especially right now, some of the discourse of Black joy and love. You know, those registers don't have to be separated from something like Black trauma. So Toni Morrison, I feel, refuses to give us an archive of pain as if that is the only theme, you know, that needs to be addressed in Black art. Absolutely, she confronts that madness, but back to art is otherwise. I think that to not understand everything she's doing with the madness, to me, means that we risk reading Morrison in a certain way as if she wants, that she wants that madness to be all determining, or that she wants to naturalize it. I think she wants to think about how Black life, Black aliveness becomes not just, and I keep saying aliveness because it's not just what some of the Afro-pessimists, for example, one strand of theory where they're just obsessed with talking about afterlife of slavery in terms of what they call social death. So it's not the madness, the horror, the trauma that's only about that social death. I think Morrison gives us the complexity of Black aliveness.
Hi, thank you all so much. I'm also a student of Kevin Kwashi's, so thank you for bringing him into the room. This is a kind of facile question, but one I feel like I would like to ask everybody on stage. On the occasion of the celebration of Morrison's incredible legacy, I wonder if you could just talk about what some of your hopes are for how we continue to understand Morrison's work and legacy, and also maybe what some of your worries might be.
I'm head of the literary estate, and my job is to make the legacy not inelegant, and to maintain it, and to keep it intact as long as I can. So most of my environment is dealing with movie producers or other, releasing other parts of the book in other places, and that's really my only obligation, is to continue that legacy. I don't want it to be, we have a very active estate, and I just don't want it to go awry in any way.
So of course, I agree with Ford's full answer, and I would also add that I think about Dana Williams' forthcoming book in terms of understanding Toni Morrison's legacy, also in terms of the network of writers, the writers that she set in motion. So if we think about Dana Williams writing the book that we've been waiting for so long, the Random House years, right? Morrison as editor. So when Morrison says about Gail Jones and Corregidor, when she says African-American literature will never be the same again, this is, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's close, where she says, how dare she, being that young, know this much. She's talking about Gail Jones and Corregidor. So I think that for me, part of the legacy of honoring this tremendous, tremendous writer is to also know that Toni Morrison wasn't writing and producing in isolation. So to lean even more into that web of relationships. I mean, I remember the first time I started going deep, very deep in the Princeton archive, and being so struck with the way in which Morrison, when she's writing to her dear friend Toni Cade Bambara, at that point, she's not Toni Morrison up here yet. And so she's writing to Toni Cade Bambara, and she refers to Toni Cade, her dear friend, as the rich, D.A. rich Toni from the poor Toni, because at that moment she's so excited about how Toni Cade Bambara is getting such attention, and she's helping her do that. She's the editor, and I think it's just one of many ways that we can remember that Morrison would be what Fred Moten calls that unalone soloist. I think that's part of, for me, the legacy, to remember those relations and to care more about them.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Or let's take two, but we'll take them in quick succession and see if we can answer them together.
Thank you. My question is with respect to the unfinished novel, basically. Justice, that is the name. And you mentioned that it's about the Korean War. So is it some sort of a sequel to Home?
No, not at all. It has a name. Is that what your question was?
Yeah. The other question, the other part of it is, is there any chance to publish it the same like, say, the novel of Until August of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which has been published after his departure?
Yeah, it's not about the Korean War. That's just the time that it takes place. And I'm still working out a few details with the publisher to figure out what to do in terms of getting that book out. Right now, it's in limbo because she passed away while writing it. And I think it needs about 8 to 10 pages, or maybe a different kind of ending, or maybe no ending at all. I'm not sure yet. So you'll have to wait and find out about that.
Thank you.
Do we have one more very short question? No? Okay. A final round of applause for our guests, please.